Good morning. Thank you for being here. Somebody put a note in the pulpit this morning, says, "You are very loved." So thank you for putting that up here. Welcome to our guest. Appreciate you being here with us. Pass along what's already been said, and we want to encourage you to remain after our service ends today so we can get to know you better. And we encourage you to fill out a connection card if you haven't done so already and leave it here so we can have a record of your visit. But just appreciate you coming our way so much. I am excited to be able to share with you the story from Luke chapter 12 today. This summer we're talking about self-denial. And during the month of June we're talking specifically about all of self and none of thee. You know, there's a song in our hymnal that we sing periodically that's given that title, All of Self and None of Thee, and kind of works through a progression as you go through each verse where the person is coming around, and finally by the last verse it's none of self and all of thee. And this summer we're going to kind of be going that way. During the month of June we're talking about selfishness and how to overcome that and ways that Satan can get to us really when we battle ourselves. And so we're going to be talking about that over the next few months as we study together. Last week we were in Matthew chapter 19 talking about the rich young ruler. And we said last week that perhaps there's no better example of someone in Scripture to at least that point in his life who lived solely for self. And you may remember that we're not told how the life of the rich young ruler ended, and we're not told if he ever came to realize the big blind spot that was decimating his spiritual life. We don't know if he ever dealt with that. And this is a person that could not see how his spirituality was being defined by the externals. He was literally going around defining himself by what he wasn't doing. And he was a person that failed to see that his righteousness would need to come from a dependence on Jesus and not himself. And so when that story ends in verse 22 of Matthew 19, he is unwilling to surrender to Jesus. He's unwilling to walk away from whatever was dearest and most pleasurable and fun and popular in order to be a servant of Christ. Today, we're going to talk together about a similar story, and that of the rich fool. And, you know, I tell you, I think this story in Luke 12 is something that is especially relevant considering our own culture. We take our wealth for granted in the United States. Our lives are literally overflowing with material things. And many of us have so many possessions that those possessions actually possess us. We are, in reality, consumers who have been consumed by consumption. And yet as you look at this story, this parable, the rich fool, it is very important to remember that the problem that is being dealt with there is not the possessions themselves. And sometimes I think when we read this story, we miss that fact. God has given us all things richly to enjoy, and so the matter here is not about things, it is about our attitude toward them. What you have in this life is only in this life. If it's material, then it belongs only to the here and now, and there is no lasting value in it whatsoever. And I want to direct you back to verse 21 of our text, where Jesus says, "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." What I want you to pull out of today's lesson, if nothing else, what I want you to see here is that verse 21 is the basic principle. We are either laying up treasures for ourselves or we are becoming rich toward God. Have you ever wondered why Jesus and the apostles teach so much on this matter? Besides the story that we read last week and the one that we're talking about today, there are all kinds of similar stories and warnings found throughout the New Testament. Luke chapter 16 with the rich man and Lazarus. James chapter 5 verses 1 through 6 with warnings about not putting too much dependence on material things. And then who could forget what Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verses 7 through 9. I tell you, our weakness here with materialism, with things, Our weakness here is particularly glaring. And while many of those warnings are out there, and many of us have read those warnings before about how you hold on to your possessions, we still fight this. And I'll tell you this, it doesn't matter if you have a lot of possessions or very few, because some who have very little still battle problems with greed and covetousness and stewardship with the things that they do have. So it doesn't matter what socioeconomic pattern and place you find yourself in. The problem is the attitude toward things. And we'll see that as we go through the lesson today. That's our plan. We're going to look at Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, and we're going to talk about the context behind this story. We're going to talk about Jesus' refusal to make a judgment in a family dispute. Then we're going to talk about the parable that he recites to illustrate the point he's trying to make. And finally, we'll wrap up with the application that Jesus makes in verse 21. So let's get started. The interactive outline is on the back side of your bulletin. I hope you open that down and follow along as we study together. Let's talk for a few moments, if we can, about the context behind our main story of the day. Our story today is actually a part of a long sermon of Jesus that begins in verse 1 of Luke 12 and continues all the way through chapter 13 and verse 9. And if you go down and look in verse 1 of Luke chapter 12, one of the things you'll see is that there are many thousands of people gathered around to hear Jesus teaching. In fact, the crowds are so great and the pressure is so heavy to see Jesus that people are actually trampling over one another to try to get to him. And while everybody's there and they're hearing the message that Jesus is delivering, Jesus' message is targeted not only just to the 12, but also to others in the audience who are honestly evaluating whether or not he is the Messiah. And so really the first part of this sermon could be summarized by two key things that need to be avoided. And both of these things characterize the culture that they lived in. I want to bring up verse 1 again. One of the things, and there's two beware statements in this first part of Luke chapter 12. One of them is here in verse 1. Be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. And so one of the things that Jesus is going to talk about in this sermon here is false religion and the love of error. And he's going to be dealing with that before we get to our story. The other main beware statement is found in verse 15, which we've already read today. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. So we have hypocrisy and we have covetousness. Those two things is one of the two main points of Jesus' sermon. Both of these are presented as pervasive, damning forces that must be avoided at all times. And why these two sins? Brothers and sisters, I want to stress to you that Jesus did not pick these two sins randomly. Remember, as we go through life, we are living in the midst of either one or two. There are only two realms. There's a spiritual realm and there is a physical realm. There is a supernatural place and there's a natural place. One is eternal, the other is temporary. One is operated or dominated by God while the other by Satan. And if you want to apply where these two sins that have already been mentioned in our text fit in, hypocrisy often happens in the religious realm while greed and covetous happen in the physical realm. And both of these things we deal with. Satan is going to work inside both of these realms to try to keep your soul out of heaven. And while we may define these things separately, they often blend together. For example, the Pharisees of the days of Jesus were often motivated by greed. In fact, the scripture tells us that. And that led them to lead hypocritical lives. And whether they had realized it or not, they had embraced false religion and the love of error while simultaneously loving material wealth. And so as you go through the first part of Luke chapter 12, Jesus is dealing with the spiritual realm and the need to be faithful through trial and persecution in order to get home to heaven. So I want to skip down to verse 13 because this is really where the story gets going. Jesus here is going to refuse to make a judgment on a family dispute. And I'm going to put verse 13 on the screen for us for just a moment. And as you look at this, I want you to imagine Jesus is there, he's standing, he's teaching, and this man breaks up through the crowd and gets right up to Jesus and just blurts out his question. And actually, as you read this, this is not a question, this is a demand. But really, when you think about everything that Jesus has been dealing with up until this point, he's been talking about hypocrisy. And you go back and you look at verses 4 through 7, he's talking about the need to serve God and trust and not to be fearful of men, and that God is intimately acquainted with us all. And in verses 8 through 12, he urges his disciples not to deny him before men or to be anxious when dragged before the courts. And then here this guy shows up, blurts in, and says, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." It's a demand. Where is this guy's heart? That's the question. Where is this guy's heart? Had he just heard anything Jesus had just been talking about? I tell you, when you look at this guy who rams up through the crowd, he is just thinking about himself. He's only into his problem. He doesn't approach Jesus with a question. It's a demand. And so evidently he thinks that Jesus must have had some ability, some power to be able to handle civil issues. Which, by the way, history tells us that that was something common for rabbis to do during the days of Jesus. But here he is, and in this moment, all he's thinking about is how he is not getting what he deserves. This is a greedy and covetous man. And so I want to look at verse 14, because basically what Jesus says here in verse 14 is, I don't know you. I don't know anything about you. I don't have a relationship with you. Who made me to be a judge over you? Now, I want you to look at the top line there on the screen of this verse. When Jesus starts out his response, he calls the man a man. Man who made me a judge over you. That term man that's used there in the text, that is not something that is endearing. It's really a rebuke. And what Jesus is trying to tell this guy is, look, my mission here is not about your personal dispute with your family. And so Jesus does not make a judgment here on the physical, but he is going to speak out about the man's spiritual condition. Look at the next verse. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So I want you just to break down this verse for just a moment. The words take care mean to look out or to observe. And I want you to see how the sentence is written in the present imperative. This is a need right now for this guy to do. The word guard is a military word, and in this context it means to keep oneself from indulging something, to watch or to guard over oneself. And he says, guard against what? All covetousness. Covetous here is the inordinate desire for riches. It is, quote, an excessive or immoderate desire for the acquiring of more and more. One person in his writing said, when you think of covetousness in this context, see a person grasping, who is grasping or extorting or constantly scheming to get more and more and more. That's this guy here in the text. And Jesus is warning him about it. What about us? Look, I think sometimes greed can cloak itself in a number of ways. It may not be just cash in the bank or the number of possessions that we have, but it can come at us in all kinds of different directions. And really what happens is if we get too concentrated on the physical, we will begin to neglect what is eternal and what is spiritual. We need to be aware of this attitude. This is why Solomon said, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. Listen to the words of Solomon there in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 10. Do we believe passages like that? Listen, the sin is not in having more or having wealth in and of itself. The sin is not in the amount you have. The sin is in the attitude that we possess. It is about how we feel with what we have. And I want to go back to the second part of verse 15 in our text. Life does not consist in the abundance of our possessions. If I'm going to view life from the perspective of how many possessions I have, then my thirst is never going to be quenched. David Bach, in his writing, has said, to define life in terms of the things is the ultimate reversal of the creature serving the creation and ignoring the Creator. In Colossians 3:5 and Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 5, greed is called idolatry because it tends to become a god that drives one to do things that are not good. We need to realize that our life is tied to God and His forgiveness, and it's all about His virtues, and we need to understand what really matters in this life. It is being faithful in response to the goodness of God. Real life, which is truly rich, is being rich toward God and not things. So, I want to take you back to the text, and I want you to look together with me at verses 16 through 20, because what Jesus is going to do here is use a parable to illustrate the point that He makes in verse 15. And it's a very relatable lesson, and it is presented from the negative. The emphasis here is, don't be like this guy. And so, I want to look at verse 16. This is the story. The land of a rich man produced plentifully. Now, here's something I learned this week. Had no idea that this was the case, but the word for plentifully here is the same word in the Greek that we use today, the word for euphoria, which is kind of interesting. And it's used in this sense here to talk about abundance, bearing healthy fruit in abundance. This guy went out and planted crops, and they were extremely successful. It's kind of like all the farmers this year here in Southwest Ohio. Beck and I were out driving Friday, could not believe how tall the corn is already. They've had a good year. Plentifully. We get the idea. And I want you to note, as you look at verse 16, there's nothing sinful. There's nothing sinful about what's going on here. There's no gain by any ill-gotten ways. This is wealth that's going to be gained honestly. And so look at verse 17. This is the dilemma. He says, what am I going to do? I have nowhere to store my crops. And so, again, I want to stress here that in and of itself, the question in verse 17 is not sinful. Making plans is certainly something that's not sinful. That's not the problem. What we're going to see in the coming verses, though, is the problem is in the attitude of the ownership of these blessings. And so I want you to look with me at verses 18 and 19. Now, what I'm going to do on this screen is I'm going to take verse 17, 18, and 19, put them all on one screen because I want to make a point. If you take verse 17 through 19 together, the word I is used 6 times. The word my is used 5 times. Now that's in the ESV. I don't know what other translations, how they do that. But where's the guy's emphasis? I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, so you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Where's the emphasis? I'll tell you what we have here. Here we have insight into the materialist point of view. This man believes that what he has is his in no uncertain terms. My crops, my barns, my grains, my goods, my soul. And so it's telling us he is fueled only by self-interest. If you're taking notes this morning, I want you to look at verse 18 again. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. Verse 18 is the only reference to a storage building in the entire Bible. It really is. And look, Americans are all into storage. How many of you actually park in your garage? How many of you have got a pole barn out back chock full of stuff? How many of you have a storage locker? We've got the stuff. We've got the stuff. And I want you to see the problem here is not in the stuff, it is in his viewpoint of it. And if you look at verse 19, he is only concerned about the acquisition of more stuff, more things for his personal enjoyment. This is a man being driven by insatiable desire. There is a lust for more and more, and it is all-consuming. The entirety of his life is focused only on wealth and the accumulation, that's the word, the accumulation of more of it. You know, this has long been a problem of mankind. All the way back in the Greeks, Plutarch said, greed never rests from the acquiring of more. This man's future perspective is only self-centered and self-indulgent. And look at verse 19. I want you to look at the word sold. Sold, you have ample goods laid up. That word sold, it's in singular form. This is only a conversation he's having with himself. He's only living in singular thought. There's no mention of his wife. There's no mention of kids. I mean, you kind of get the picture here. This guy is alone. You ever known anybody like that? Rich, wealthy, they're so selfish, they've run everybody else off in their life, and all they've got is themselves. That's the imagery I kind of pull out of this. And I just look at that and just go, how sad that is. You know, this guy is already wealthy. Go back to verse 16. He's already wealthy before the plentiful harvest. And you just have to wonder if all the greed in his life had squeezed everybody else out. But no matter what that is, whether that was the case or not, he's thinking right now at this moment, I can sit back and relax. I've got it all. And as you read these verses that are on the screen, what did he forget? What did he forget? God, others, and his mortality. God, others, and mortality. That's what he forgot. He morally mismanaged his wealth. He took no thought to others. He took no thought to thanking God. So Bach in his writing has said the danger of the pursuit of possessions is that it can make one insensitive to people. Greed can create a distortion about what life is because the definition of life is not found in objects, but in relationships, and especially to God and his will. That's what happened here. And what does God say about this? Look at verse 20. God calls him what? A fool. The soul that had hoped for ease has now been ordered to attention. Going on here, when God addresses this man as a fool, he indicates that the man's blindness in judging life's priorities. The man's soul is being weighed in the balance. And on that scale, the possessions the man has and the social resume he has built register no weight whatsoever. Are we listening to that? We spend a lifetime building up and acquiring possessions. We spend a lifetime building up a human reputation and an educational credentials and all these kind of things. What's it going to matter on the day that we die? He cannot take these things with him to the bar of divine justice. Only his naked character will be on that balance. The man whose life is possessions makes himself a paperweight at the final judgment. hope that gets our attention. Because this is a man in our story who's mindless about the truth. He's about to experience the greedy man's worst nightmare, and that is somebody else gets it all. When you look at 12:20, soul, this night your soul is required of you, and whose will be those things you have acquired? It connects very well with what Solomon said back in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or foolish. Solomon is saying, I've gotten all this. Well, there was no more wealthy person in the world but Solomon. And he's saying it's probably all going to wind up in the hands of somebody else. It's vanity. And if we go back to our text in verse 20, God said, your soul is required of you. It is the height of foolishness, brothers and sisters, to make all of our plans and forget God and to forget others and to forget our own mentality. And that is why James said, come now, today or tomorrow, we will go into such a town and spend an hour there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll live and do this or that. Do we heed the wisdom of James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15? Let's look at the application as we close our lesson today. I want us to look at verse 21. Jesus says, so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Those who are busy laying up treasure for themselves are mindless if they have not given consideration to God, because one day we will all face God. And if we haven't given the consideration that we're going to die one day, we're just going to live like we're going to live forever, that reality is going to come up to us very quickly, and it is not going to be pleasant. And think of this story. Here, this guy is dead before any of his plans can be realized. He's gone, just like that. If we're not going to use what God has given us for his glory, if we have not dealt with our own mortality, we are a fool. If we have not invested in God's kingdom, we are in trouble. And so my question for you today is, in what are you investing? This is why Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moss and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. Verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It is selfish to be a materialist. It is selfish to be greedy and covetous and indulgent. It is selfish to hoard what we have and keep it all for ourselves. One day, we're going to leave it all behind. So is the man who lays up treasure for himself. It is not about what you have. It is about what you do with what you have. And so the question as we wrap up the lesson today is this: what will it be for you? Will it be all of self and none of thee? Or will you commit to following Jesus' admonition in Luke 12:15 and Luke 12:21 by being generous all the time? And when God blesses you with more than you need, remember that the first consideration is not to go build a bigger barn. The first consideration is toward God and to others. The first consideration is your own mortality. And so the admonition is, let us not be consumed by material wealth. So 2 weeks, 2 stories about men who are all about self and none about God. We need to take these warnings seriously. And we need to make sure that we are in the process of practicing self-denial, because it is not all about us. It's all about our God, who has blessed us with all things, including our salvation. So where are your priorities today? Are you looking only to this world, or are you looking and investing in the world to come? That's the question. And if you have not yet begun to invest in that world to come, then today is the day to get started, and we'd love to help you do that. Please think about your soul this morning. If there's any question about where you might spend eternity, you don't need to leave here with that question still being unanswered. You need to leave here today with the ability, with confidence, to say, I am going home to heaven. I am going to be with my God. I am going to be with my Savior. And I'm going to spend eternity there forever. If you can answer that question in the affirmative, then this invitation is for you. We can help you today put on Christ. We can help you today to rededicate yourself, whatever your need is. Let it be known as we stand and sing.